Today, I just want to talk about student-led assessment. Student-led assessment is the art of getting students actively involved in their assessment at all levels. It's not just about them deciding this is how they're going to be assessed. It's actually asking their feedback all the way through and getting to think about it. Think about assessment as a learning process as opposed to an end product. If you could just move to the next slide, please. Okay, so by the end of this session, you will have a working definition of student-led assessment. You'll be able to discuss some of the advantages of student-led assessment and consider some ways of using student-led assessment in your classes. Thank you. Sorry, I have animations going on. So if you click through, just go from animations. Okay, I'm aware of time, so I'm not going to ask you to go take a minute to think about the purposes. We just go through them. This is what I think are the main purposes of assessment. So assessment should always inform our teaching practice. So we should use the assessment to think about different ways that we can reach the students. We should think about it not only to tell us what content to deliver next, but to tell us how to deliver that content, thinking about the students' learning styles, different delivery methods we can use, where we can be online, when we can use technology, when it has to be hands-on practice. Assessment should be helping us in all of these areas. Assessment should drive learning. It should be really clear to the students at every step what they need to do next. It should motivate them to find that next level. So it shouldn't be opaque. It should always be really clear and visible and structured in a way that helps the student to the next level. Now, it doesn't matter what level it is. If they're the lowest level, it helps them to the next step. If they're near the top, it helps them to reach the very highest levels. But it should be clear steps for them all the way through. It should inform students of their own progress in specific skills, knowledge, or understanding. So again, the student should know how well they're achieving. And finally, it should inform instruction. So it should tell us that we will know what we need to teach next. I'm hoping what you've realized is at no point have I said it should be a final step. Assessment should always be an ongoing process for us as teachers, but also for the students. So assessment is never about this is an end goal. It's all about what can we do to get to the next step? Where are we? What do we do next? Thank you. I can move on to the next one. This is just a title page. This is a definition that I found from Deanna Sen, who's an expert in student-led assessment. She wrote several books on the topic, which I thought is a pretty succinct summary. So student-led assessment is when students take an active role in assessing their own learning and tracking their progress towards a learning target. So again, it's progress. And a really useful way, I think, of us visualizing this is to look at the different models. In front of us now is what I would call a traditional teaching paradigm. There's a curriculum document which the teacher reads and interprets, and the teacher then delivers that to a student. And it's a very linear process, just goes from curriculum, teacher, student. If you go to teacher-led progress, it's on this page. It's the teacher obviously has a link to the curriculum and the student, but the student also is seeing the curriculum, and each of these steps goes both ways. There's always a negotiation going on between the teacher, the curriculum, and the students. One of the things you need to do to make this work is to make sure the students always see the curriculum. So we should always be giving them the learning expectations. They should see what they are. It shouldn't be opaque, and it should never be opaque. It should always be the student getting involved. And technology makes this very easy for us to do and trace, because you can do something as simple as a Google form tracking sheet, where you start of a session, you put some questions with the head about the curriculum document and see what the students already know and what they think they need to know to get to the expectation. And at the end of a session, you can do something, you can do the similar, or you can do an exit note, which you can do digitally now. And this allows them to track progress. It gives us a very simple view. If you use Google Forms, it will actually give you a statistical analysis But if you want to use other doc forms as well, it works where the students are giving you the information they need. So there's some advantages to student-led assessment. It's fair assessments because assessment is now seen as a process rather than a product. If it's always an end product, and I mean, the UK went back towards final exam models where it's all about the final product. You can have a bad day and the grade's not going to be an accurate reflection. You could be suffering from anxiety. It's not an accurate reflection of what you've achieved and what abilities you've got. If it's an ongoing process, the students are involved. They can see what the next step is. We can track progress. We can always scaffold it to individual learners so everybody can make progress at a different way. It's much fairer. Again, I say assessment is ongoing. So students are invited to reflect and evaluate their own work. So by evaluating their own work in an ongoing way, they usually get a deeper understanding. As the next point. When they did studies about students who've been taught in a traditional model with end level exams and with students who are taught through a student-led approach, typically the students in the student-led approach will achieve one level higher than students on the traditional one, because actually they're thinking about it at every step. They're synthesizing the information into their own learning, and it's giving them a deeper understanding of what they can do and what they need to do. And then finally, students reinforce and extend the scaffolding of their own learning because they're thinking about it all the time and they're thinking about what they can do next. They're actually helping you with scaffolding that they're learning. And then the teacher's role becomes more to be a resource and a facilitator rather than delivering content. If we're just delivering content, it's going to help some students. Usually the medium students, we focus on the students in the middle. It's normal when you've got 25 students and you've got to try and deliver a session, you're going to look at the bulk. But when going for student-led model, then we're going to allow them to scaffold their own learning, and this helps students at all sections. Thank you, John. So when should we use student-led assessment? We should really do this from as early an age as possible. We can do this in kindergarten. I saw a really good example in one of the kindergarten classes in my own school, where the assessment was all about coordination. It was about developing coordination skills. So what they got the students to do before is they were going to paint a tree, but they got the students to describe what the tree was going to look like, and they were then assessed from the coordination whether they managed to make it look like what they wanted it to look like. Now, they all had different ideas of what a tree should look like. I mean, usually they had green leaves and brown branches, but they had different ideas. They weren't assessed on the tree, what they described as, they were assessed on how they described the tree versus the coordination. And that was a kindergarten class. But always getting the students to do is think very early about what they need to do. So we should start as early as possible. Just click, please, John. Yeah, so we can use it to identify long-term goals. So this can be for career-related things. You need what learning you need by your graduation. What do you need to do for this specific job? What internet research can you do? Do you need to start networking LinkedIn? So students can start identifying their own long-term goals and working out what they need to do. In the system I work in, the students do 30 courses between grade 9 and 12, and it leads to a general diploma. But specific university courses, specific jobs have specific requirements of which courses. The students get a lot of choice on what courses they can take. So by student-led assessment, it helps them to shape their own ideas and start planning for what they need to do long-term. We can use it for short-term learning for course or unit-specific competencies. So I use checklists at the start of the semester when I'm doing a technology course. There's a list of competencies, and I give them a chance to rate themselves on each of those competencies at the start. And then regularly, every few weeks throughout the course, we'll just have a 15-minute reflection time where they can go back on the checklist and change and adjust it as they go through. And what this lets students do is really see their own progress when they're checking boxes off, and they can see the skills all the way through. We can use it for experiential learning. So we can show students what are expected to learn skills or competencies. I use Google Stories. I was doing a geography course, and we were doing stuff about the Silk Road. So yeah, the traveling across from Europe into Asia, delivering the first boxes. And I used Google Stories because obviously students in Northern Egypt can't be expected to have experienced all these things. But using Google Maps and Google Stories, we could follow the path of one of these traders across the Silk Road. It helps them with additional research sources. A lot of museums now are doing interactive 3D tours that you can go online, so we can use this as part of the process. And we can use them with how they assessed. And this I find is particularly useful with students with additional learning needs. I had a student who was excellent at visual communication, but he couldn't represent himself with written word at all. So he was doing essay-based work and report writing, and he was really struggling to get grades, even though the knowledge was there and the ability was there. So we sat down and we spoke to him, and we said, well, okay, how about making animation? He was very good at animating, and he had a very creative way of thinking in animation. So instead of writing a written report, he presented the same information as an animation, and it was amazing. And he got very, very high grades. So we can use student-led assessment to get students to present the information in a way. Oftentimes, as teachers, we get drawn into traditionally, like essay marking is the most common one. But often the curriculum doesn't specifically say it has to be an essay, it just needs to say they present information or they can research. So we can work with the students to find ways that they can present and display their knowledge and understanding in a way that will suit their needs more. And finally, I think there should be one more, John. Yeah. We should use it for self-evaluation of learning and demonstrating the results. Assessment shouldn't end at the end of the product. We can evaluate, get students to evaluate and think about what they could do next, think about what they could do to improve all the way. And finally, I've got two short examples of student-led assessment, very extreme ends of what student-led assessment might look like. This one was taken from my son's art class. So I saw this, I was going to his Google Classroom and I saw this and I just thought this is a really nice way of starting the class. So his teacher just put up a Google form quiz in the stream, which just asked them these two questions. So what do you already know about form and function with art? And so it's asked them to be specific, get as much information as they can. And then what do you want to learn about form and function? Be specific. There had been a short, brief session where they discussed this before, just to make sure their students knew what form and function were as a framework. But there's just these two questions. And this is really useful, I think, because she teaches the grade 7 classes. She didn't teach in grade 6, grade 5, grade 4. And form and function is just a small part of the curriculum. So this helps find out what prior learning they've had, because every teacher's going to have a slightly different idea of what it should look like. So the students could tell her what they know, and she can then shape the future sessions based on what they've learned. So it's very simple, takes very little time, but it lets the students get involved very early. And finally, this is one I've used for a grade 12 research project. So we've taught different quantitative research techniques, and then the curriculum expectation is just that they can form a quantitative research project. So I've gave them a very broad, open task, and what they will do is they will individually design their own research project that uses a quantitative technique to answer a question of your choice. So these are grade 12, these are 17, 18-year-olds. And in the research project, I've asked them to write a section on methodologies where they discuss different approaches they could use, and then they choose one. And then they're going to do the project themselves. And when I assess them, what I'm going to be assessing them on is if they've correctly applied their methodology as they said they will apply it. and then the results. I'm not going to be assessing whether it's the one I would have chosen. I'm assessing how successfully they've applied the methodology and the techniques they're going to use. The full document is much longer than this, and I have got the marking rubric as we use attached, but when I try to open it earlier, it's probably not going to open, so I won't show you. But the rubric itself, it's quite open, and it says things like, for the highest grades, 80% plus, you have a thorough understanding, or you've applied the techniques in a thorough way. And then it's consistently for satisfactory, and in a limited way for the lower grades. So it's very broad, open rubric. Okay, so I think that's the last slide. Should be any questions there?
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. That was really interesting. Another great talk there. Just while I open up the chat to look at some questions, a couple of observations, I guess, in the first one. Well, first one's an observation and then a question. But when you were talking about the role of the teacher, for me, I could see it's a changed relationship. The teacher's almost becoming a coach to the student. Do you think that's a fair assessment? Do you see similarities there?
Yes, absolutely. So I said facilitator, I think was the word, but yeah, we involved with the teachers and we're that resource, but we're no longer the gateway to the knowledge. We're no longer the gatekeepers. We should be helping them find their own paths. And I think that's super important, because the information available to the world now is so much more complex than it was when we were learners. So we should try and help them, guide them where we can, and coach. I think that's a really nice way of saying it. But yeah, we're no longer the gatekeepers of the knowledge. I think with technology, our role has to change.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I guess the question that I'd like to follow up with is, how have the students responded?
The vast majority respond very well once they start seeing the results. It's normally a little bit of resistance at first, because and actually, when I first did this in the UK a few years ago, I didn't have that much resistance. I think the students were more open to this idea. And I think it's because we do separate. I did this in sixth form college in the UK, and obviously they were expecting a change because they left school and went to a sixth form. Now in Egypt, it's a kindergarten to grade 12 school, and they still see the relationship all the way through as the teacher spoon feeding information, and still an expectation that that's what education is. So the students here were a bit more resistant, and I think that's because of the prior relationships. But once they started seeing the results and they started understanding why we were doing things, rather than just expecting me to give them an answer, most of the students really enjoy it, because it gives them a lot more freedom in what they're going to do. Even if it's a subject they don't like, they can normally find an angle that they do enjoy a bit more. And once they start getting the results back and they can see, because one of our learning pillars is thinking, and actually it's very difficult to do that in a spoon-fed system, because they're just repeating knowledge back to you. Yeah. Whereas thinking, they have to actually show that they've done their own research and they've applied that research in a useful way. And they see their thinking grades go, that's the one that goes up most significantly. The others all go up a little bit, but the thinking grade was going up significantly. And once they see that, they buy into it. But it sometimes takes a little bit of time at the start. I think this is why ideally we start doing this all the way through at JK, and then it's just normal for them by the time they get, say I teach in high school, by the time they get to me, it's just their normal part of their life and education.
I mean, as you're saying, and Suzy's commenting in the chat as well, I mean, this is self-directed learning. It's far more empowering and they're more motivated. I've got one final question before we go on to Tijani, and that's, I'm curious to know, is this across the whole school, or is it just being driven by you? And if it is being driven by you, how do your colleagues respond?
Yeah, at the moment, I've built relationships with some of the teachers throughout the school. So there's teachers in pretty much every grade level. And I think what's happened is younger teachers, I'm embracing it. I think it's more people who've been teaching a long time. I think a little bit more set in the ways. Not all, it's not exactly that. There's been one of the people who embraced it the most actually is our oldest teacher, but it's a general trend. It's the newer teachers are embracing it more. And actually, I think again, what you realize once you've started doing this, it's actually making your job easier because you're not having to manage and store and gatekeep all that information. The students are working themselves. All you really got to do is keep that relationship with the students going, which we should be doing anyway. And everything else, the students are doing a lot more of the work, so it makes it easier for the teacher as well. And again, the teachers realise that they're buying into it, but there's some teachers, if you've been doing it for 20 years a very fixed way, it's difficult to change.
I think you make a really good point there as well, because making life easier for the teacher, because you're not teaching to the middle, to the bulk, as you were saying. Actually, this is personalized and letting the students take responsibility. I did say that was my last question, but I noticed Ivan's just come back, so I'm going to just slip this in. So to Johnny, if you can start getting ready. Ivan's comment here is learner-centered learning and assessment makes learning fun, makes learners active and creative. How do you initiate learner assessment to early childhood learners? So actually, this is quite nice because it comes back a little bit. Well, it's probably a little bit younger for Alberta's comments, but because I know the example that you had there, it was quite. The first example was quite early. That was what year?
Yeah, it was a JK, so 4-year-olds. That one was for where obviously the question itself didn't directly relate to the assessment because the question was, what does a tree look like? And the assessment was all to do with the physical skills. But what it was getting, getting the students to think about it first in quite a simple way at that point. But it's just introducing the idea of thinking about the questions. At early years, obviously, I wouldn't expect them to be developing assessment strategies or a complex assessment strategies or their own deep research. It's just to get them thinking about it and feel more involved, because then of course you say to them, what does the tree look like? And they paint a tree and it might not look like a tree to me, but if it looks like their description, then it's really well done. And you can still give them the thumbs up and the encouragement, and the student's going to feel really involved. And it's just kind of changing the culture, I think, more for early years. So by the time it gets a little bit later on, they're used to being asked questions about their assessment. And they're not, it's breaking that habit of thinking teaching is me spoon feeding you information and then you regurgitating that same information to me, which we do see sometimes in some schools still in the modern world. We shouldn't see that so much anymore, but I know that rote learning method some countries still use that as the basis of their education systems.
Yeah, and funny, just as you were talking, I was reminded of Ken Robinson. And one of his TED Talks is about that natural curiosity of our children as they start the education system, and that kind of gets squeezed out of them with the rote learning. So you can really see what a fantastic opportunity and how it actually keeps them engaged throughout the education system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was Ken Robinson, wasn't it? He said that if we do a creative test on the students at 4 or 5, everyone's a genius. And by the time you get to 10 or 12, none of us are.
Brilliant. On that note, I'm going to park it there.